Hello. So in the last video, we were talking about the chain rule and how it can be used to find derivatives. However, I think that in that video, it was maybe less clear because we didn't have any solid examples, so I thought that I'd give one in this video and a few to come. So we're going to be dealing with the function, and I'm going to call it h of x is equal to, what is that going to be equal to? Let's say the sine of cosine of x. Okay, so, and we're of course trying to find h prime of x. We're trying to find what that is equal to. Okay, so what does the chain rule tell us? I think that that's maybe the most helpful thing to think of. Chain rule tells us, I'm going to write that up here, chain rule, that tells us that the derivative with respect to x of f of g of x, right? We have two functions. One is a function of the other function of x. And this is going to be equal to the derivative of f with respect to g, right? Where g is essentially what we're saying our input variable is instead of x. And then we're making sure that that g, which is a function of x, does remain a function of x in there. And I'll get to that in a moment. And we're multiplying that by the derivative of g with respect to x. There we go. So, you know, g and f, where does that come from? Well, let's say that, let's say we have f of x is equal to sine x, and g of x is equal to cosine of x. Therefore, h of x, our actual function h of x, and maybe it would be helpful to do that in white to distinguish that this is the function we're talking about. H of x would then be equal to, and I'm going to switch back to red, that's going to be equal to f of g of x, right? F of g of x. I'm sorry. Yeah, f of g of x. There we go. My pen is not cooperating today. H of x is f of g of x, right? Because it's equal to sine of cosine of x, which is the same as f of g of x. Okay, and if the idea of f of g of x is kind of a confusing idea, essentially we're just taking the relationship f and then making g of x its input variable there. So if f is sine of x, right, the input variable is x, but we're turning that into, that input variable is going to be g of x, so we just plug g of x in for x. G of x is, of course, equal to cosine of x, so we have sine of cosine of x. If that's strange, it would be good to review algebra 2, so that, because that's definitely needed going forward. So h of x is going to be this f of g of x. So therefore, by that same reasoning, h prime of x is going to be equal to, what did it say for our formula? When we're taking the derivative of f of g of x, which is going to be our h of x. Well, this is going to be the derivative of f with respect to g times the derivative of g with respect to x. And we already know the derivative of g with respect to x, right? That's just g prime of x. So, and I'm going to write this down here. So g of x, we know that g prime of x, because this is just something we know, it's one of those derivatives that it's important to just know off the top of your head. G prime of x, where g of x is cosine of x, is going to be negative sine of x. So we already have part of this down, right? This here is negative sine of x. But what about this df dg? And this is where it gets the most interesting. So the derivative of f with respect to g, we're essentially pretending, because we have the function sine of cosine of x here, right, where sine of x is our f of x. We're taking the derivative of sine of x not with respect to x here. We're not taking the derivative of this whole thing here with respect to x. We're just taking it with respect to g. Okay? So Well, what does that mean? Well, what we're doing is essentially saying that cosine of x here, we're just saying that's something like u or something, right? That's just going to be u. And so we have the h of x, hey, wait, that's actually equal to sine u, right? I could say h of u, right? Or more importantly, that, yeah, we have that plugged in there. So the derivative of f with respect to, and now g is equal to u, right? Because cosine of x is equal to u and cosine of x is g. U is g of x. So what we're really taking, I'm going to write this down here, f prime of x, f prime of g of x, sorry, f prime of g, I guess f prime of g of x is also correct. F prime of g of x is going to be the same as f prime of u, right, where u is g of x. All right, so what's the function f of u? Well, we have that down here. F of u is equal to sine u. We already know that. That's just, f of x is sine x, so f of u is sine u, right? U is just a variable. So f prime of u, we're just saying, u is x, right? It doesn't matter. F prime of u is equal to, what's the original function? Sine of u, so the derivative is going to be cosine of u. That's another one of those derivatives you just know. But what's u, right? So now we have to plug in for what u is actually. So let's bring that all the way down. So we then know that f prime of g of x is going to be equal to not cosine of u, but cosine of g of x, which is the cosine of x. So cosine of x. So now we have, and this of course is df with respect to g. So now we have this value, right? And this value, and we just multiply them. Right? That's not too hard. So let's bring that back here. So our final h of x is going to be the same as these multiplied. So we have cosine of x, and I'm just moving this down a little bit, fill the space, times negative sine of x, or that h prime, I hope this loads correctly, there we go, h prime of x is equal to negative sine x times cosine of x. And that's a really weird function, but that is the derivative of our function h of x. So all we did, it might look like a lot here, but you should really get used to doing this in your head. You just essentially ignore this inner function here. You say, this cosine of x here, that's just some variable u or something, and then we take the derivative of the outside as if that inner function isn't a thing. Then we plug in that inner function to the derivative that we find. In this case, we found, we found the derivative of sine of u, which is cosine of u, right? We have that here, and then we plugged in for u. So you're looking at like, oh, sine of x, the derivative of sine of x is cosine of x, but then, right, we're taking the cosine of not x, but that inner function. So you just have to remember that that inner function stays there, and then at the end we multiply by the derivative of the inner function with respect to x, given that we have the function h of x here. And this would be our final answer. I know it's really wordy, and in this video I wanted to go through all of the steps, but it is going to get faster and easier, as I think we'll see in the next following videos. Thanks for watching.